Welcome to my beginner's guide to PvE healing in the Elder Scrolls Online. In this video I will explain the most important things you need to understand to have fun and success as a healer. We will talk about activities, class choice, playstyle, builds, settings and more. But with how much information you can find online, why should you even trust this guide? Who am I to tell you how you should play? I am a seasoned and experienced player, active since 2014 and passionate theory crafter. Over multiple thousand hours of experience, I accomplished the most difficult achievements and high leaderboard positions many times. I led guilds and raiding groups and trained players from beginners to high-end progress. But I put many hours of research and testing into this guide as well, also working together with other experienced players. Also, the footage in the background shows the builds featured later in this video, with 300 champion points spent, purple gear, and in dungeon finder groups. So you can see that they are actually working, and I'm not giving myself any unfair advantages for testing. But let's start with the actual content. Why should you even play a healer, and what should you expect? Healer is, at least in my opinion, the most dynamic and varied role. Healers in ESO do a lot more than just keeping the group alive. The additional tasks are mostly supporting the group with offensive and defensive effects, as well as resources, but can also include taking on specific mechanics, dealing damage, or even tanking. For this guide, we will, however, limit it to just healing and support. The role of a healer in PvE is mechanically a bit simpler than that of a tank or damage dealer, however often requires more general knowledge and understanding of the game. Situationally adjusting my build and playstyle is essential to being successful as a healer. I need to understand the content, my build, but also the builds and tasks of my teammates. Therefore, this guide will, amongst other things, also focus on teaching you general understanding of the game and independent decision making. Next, we will look at what PvE activities you can even do as a healer. Of course, you can also play in groups for open world content and heal in activities such as world bosses, dolmen, hero storms and so on. Most relevant for healing are, however, the three instant group activities: dungeons, trials and arenas. These three come in two different difficulties, normal and veteran. On veteran difficulty, the final boss, and for some newer activities all bosses, feature a hard mode, an additional difficulty modifier that you can activate before the fight. For choosing the right activities, you can use the release dates for orientation. Content of the base game is the easiest and the DLCs get harder the newer they are. You should begin with dungeons, the most basic PvE group activity and the only one with a group finder. Once you work your way up to the DLC dungeons, you can also start looking into trials and arenas. Many players hesitate on those activities, but they are actually somewhere in between the DLC dungeons in difficulty. However, foreknowledge is often a lot more important for trials and arenas, as the core mechanics are not as obvious or even foreshadowed as they usually are in dungeons. But if you have done your research and understand the mechanics, there is no reason why you shouldn't try out trials or arenas. In fact, I would recommend the same approach for the harder dungeon content as well, unless you play with a group that provides you explanations. When looking up guides as a healer, it is also important to always look at the other roles as well, so you get an idea of how it will be to heal those players. Anyways, on the normal difficulty, all of this isn't that important. However, for veteran difficulty, I highly recommend roughly sticking to this graphic and doing your research. For finding groups, at least on normal difficulty, you can use the zone chat. I would, however, highly recommend finding a good beginner-friendly guild. Healer as a support role is a lot more fun with a coordinated group, and such guilds allow you to properly learn and grow with the increasingly difficult content. You can also get feedback from your group, which is very important for a healer. And on the other hand, as a healer, I also want to have control over the behavior of my group, and that only works properly in coordinated groups with voice chat. Let's continue with the character creation, and thereby the choice of race and class. The racial choice is overall not that important for a healer. It is absolutely possible to perform well in all content with any race. Nevertheless, a good choice can make it substantially easier. Since healers are generally Magicka based, Breton, Khajiit, Alderman and Dunmer are the best choices. Argonians are relatively okay as well. For beginners, I absolutely recommend Breton though. The class choice is a lot more complex. Generally, every class can heal. Builds and playstyles are also to a large degree class independent. The strength of a class for healing is mostly determined by two factors: The first one is, well, healing. So primarily the effectiveness and reliability of the healing abilities, and also to a lesser degree the class's overall healing power. The second aspect is the support, so which buffs and debuffs and synergies the class provides. Keep in mind though that the class only determines part of your healing and support, as a lot of it comes from class independent skill lines and gear as well. We will talk about all of that in more detail later, but so far this is pretty straightforward, right? Just calculate the power of each class and you have your ranking, right? Well, I could make a whole video series on why which class is used for which activity and in which group composition. It is a very complex topic. So for this video, I will only give you a very rough assessment. You need to decide for yourself if this assessment is relevant for you or not. If you only want to run easier content without much optimization, it will most likely not matter to you. But if you have any plans to at some point raid at a high level, you should absolutely take my advice into account. So, Templar is overall rather easy to play with a very reliable and versatile kit. The support is pretty good, however exclusively offensive, situational and a bit more complex to play. Templar is used a lot across all content and remains very popular all the way up to high-end groups. In my opinion, Templar is a very good choice. Warden is easy to play, brings very potent and versatile support, and very powerful healing. It can be played very well in all content at all levels. This makes Warden the class I absolutely recommend the most for beginners. Sorcerer is a generally well-working, relatively simple, and versatile healing class. The healing is pretty strong and it provides some relevant support as well. Sorcerer primarily functions well and is popular in dungeons and arenas. However, it is barely seen in raids, especially at higher levels. I can nevertheless still recommend Sorcerer for beginners. Necromancer is probably the strongest, but also the most complex healing class. It offers extremely strong offensive support, but also some defensive support and strong healing. Therefore, Necromancer is particularly popular with high-level raiding groups. I wouldn't recommend it too much for beginners though. Nightblade is on the more difficult side. The healing is pretty strong, though mechanically not ideal. Nightblade offers basically no support. It works well in easy activities due to passive healing output and high damage and mobility, but in anything beyond that, Nightblade healers are very rare, and that is for good reasons. So I would not recommend the class at all. Dragon Knight is also a bit more difficult to play, mostly because the healing is really weak and unreliable. However, the support is potentially pretty strong, but it is also situational. Dragon Knight healers are basically unheard of, despite being potentially good in some situations. I would overall not recommend playing it though. Next we will go over how healing and support generally works in ESO, so you understand how and why the builds we will look at afterwards even work. To keep it short and understandable, we will do without the mathematics. You should, however, know that healing scales similar to damage, so for Magicka based abilities, that is with Magicka, spell damage, critical chance, and critical healing power. Additionally, there are the modifiers healing done and healing taken that both increase healing as well. Healing abilities can be categorized in two ways. Firstly, into burst healing and healing over time, usually referred to as HOT. Secondly, into single target and AoE, which stands for area of effect. In PvE, most healing is done with AoE HOTs, so area of effect healing over time, because keeping up multiple AoE HOTs results in the cheapest, strongest, and most reliable healing. Burst healing is then used to counter high and unexpected damage spikes. Usually, AoE variants are preferred for burst healing as well. Single target is only really used in exceptional cases, when the group is extremely split up, needs to move a lot, or players tasked with special roles far outside the group require healing. The targeting of healing and support is mostly automatic. Normal healing prioritizes the target with the lowest health. Other effects can, however, have other priorities. Healers learn how to work with the system over time. However, we never have complete control over our targeting, and the system is often very unreliable. That is also one of the reasons why we use AoE healing. AoE healing hits 6 targets, as long as the tooltip doesn't state otherwise, which is also the reason why you need to use certain skills twice in 12-player groups, by the way. By hitting more players at once, we increase our chances of hitting what we actually want. Additionally, ground abilities can be controlled pretty well with the placement. A mistake often made by ambitious beginners and especially players coming to ESO from other MMOs is avoiding overheal, so healing above the maximum health of the target. This is, however, a very inefficient and potentially even detrimental playstyle. If you study the logs of good groups, you will discover that above 70% overheal is completely normal. That means less than 30% of the healing is actually compensating incoming damage. So why is that? Well, first of all, incoming damage is simply inconsistent in most fights. It is, however, more efficient for a healer to keep up the healing consistently. This is primarily because many healing abilities have additional effects that should be kept up even if there is no incoming damage. But a more consistent playstyle also leads to better resource management and shorter reaction times. When all healing is already active before damage is taken, it will be healed up quicker and without wasting resources on burst healing. Another topic I mentioned multiple times already is support. So what is support and why is it so important? Dealing more damage while taking less damage is a concept that not only applies to high-end optimization, but to absolutely everyone. The better you become, the more support you will be able to provide your group. But even for beginners, it is crucial to play a basic level of support. By providing defensive support, so your group takes less damage, and by providing offensive support, so your group deals more damage and fights are quicker, you also make it a lot easier on yourself because you need to heal that much less. A third, equally important form of support is resource support. By providing additional stamina and magicka, you allow your group to deal more damage as well as play better defensively. To support the group, healers have 3 different kinds of tools at their disposal. Firstly, buffs, positive effects on group members. Secondly, debuffs, negative effects on enemies. And thirdly, synergies, effects that other players can activate themselves. With that, it is important to understand what effects can be stacked and what can't. For synergies, it is pretty straightforward. Each different synergy has a 20-second cooldown for the player taking it. Synergies that are not provided by players and are part of a fight mechanic instead, like sigils in arenas for example, have no cooldown. For buffs and debuffs, it isn't all that complicated either. Individual effects can only be active once. So the question is, what counts as an individual effect? Most effects fall into the major and minor category. For those, the major and minor versions are 2 individual effects. So you can, for example, stack major sorcery with minor sorcery. However, you cannot stack 2 instances of major sorcery. For effects that don't fall into the major and minor category, each source is its own individual effect. You can, for example, stack the weakness against flame damage from a Dragon Knight's Engulfing Flames with that of the Encratis Behemoth set. However, you cannot stack the weakness against flame damage from Engulfing Flames of 2 different Dragon Knights. So different sources are different sets, abilities, or enchantments, and not the same set or ability on 2 different players. If you have the same effect twice, the longer one will override the shorter one. All of this, however, only applies to buffs and debuffs. Dealing a damage can freely be stacked by different players. Next we will talk about rotations. In order to properly use my build in combat, I need a sequence or priorities by which I use my skills. There are 2 general approaches. I can use my abilities statically in a planned out order, or dynamically based on timers, the situation, or just gut feeling. Especially for healing, static rotations are suboptimal, as a healer is always required to play reactively. A completely dynamic rotation, on the other hand, is quite hard to perform, especially for beginners. What I will show you in this guide is therefore a compromise. We play all long-lasting skills we want to constantly keep up in a static partial rotation and use the remaining time to then dynamically use our more situational and reactionary skills, such as burst healing. I absolutely recommend sticking to the exact order of skills for the static part of the rotation. Otherwise you will end up with a mess, get confused, and your healing and support will suffer. It is also crucial to keep up the rotation in difficult situations. In fact, the more messy the fight gets, the more important it is to keep up your rotation, as it gives you the strongest and most reliable healing output. In fact, not having enough potential healing is almost never an issue in ESO. You don't need more healing power for more difficult activities. Good healers often even play significantly less healing than the builds I will show you in this video. Using your healing correctly is what really matters. This has many aspects, some of which you cannot control, but a proper rotation is the absolute basis for any of it to work. An important mechanic to understand for an effective rotation is the global cooldown. Activating an ability triggers a global cooldown that keeps you from activating further abilities for 1 second. This is, however, only the case for abilities and not dodge, block, bar swap, light or heavy attacks, and so on. In practice, this means that you don't have to pause your rotation in order to dodge an incoming attack or weapon swap. Another application of the system is weaving. Weaving means doing a light attack before every skill. For this, you simply press light attack ever so slightly before each ability. Because light attacks don't trigger a global cooldown, you basically perform a light attack and ability simultaneously, increasing your damage and proccing your enchantment and ultimate regeneration with no trade-off. You also don't have to play your rotation any slower for weaving to work. Just make sure you don't press abilities too early or multiple times, so you don't queue them overriding your light attacks. Mastering weaving takes quite a bit of practice, and you can ignore it for now should it really be too much for you, but I highly recommend properly learning it at some point. And since this section was very theoretical, I will now show you the practical application in an example. The main focus here is on how I position myself and place my AoEs. I place my healing so that it properly covers the group's area of movement and try to stack them as much as possible. If players move further apart, I might have to split up my AoEs accordingly. When a single player has to move far outside of the group for some mechanic, I need to decide whether I give this player one of my HOTS or leave everything on the group and keep that player alive by burst healing. This choice is very situational. I also have more than enough time and resources in this example, so I often recast my rotation early to adjust to the group's movement and lengthen the time frame in which I wouldn't need to recast anything. For my own positioning, the group isn't making it easy on me here. At least both DDs stay reasonably close to the boss, however they are constantly split up. I react to that by going far to one side of the group to have both of them lined up in front of me. This gives me a good overview and makes it easy to hit my combat player properly. When the group moves, I adjust my positioning as well, to always stay in a similar position and don't let damage dealers get away from me. Towards the end of the fight, when the damage dealers are losing a lot of health, I'm not concerned at all and just keep doing my thing. I know that I have all my healing down on them and nothing can really happen. I just pay attention to properly keep up my rotation and staying in a position that would allow me to react. I use Combat Prayer a bit more often, however, to deliberately heal through some of the damage, just to not take any unnecessary risks. But I always prioritize my rotation. Now that you have a fundamental understanding of the healer role, we will go over the actual skill setups for each class. As I already said, the playstyle is almost identical across all classes, and larger differences only appear with the more complex builds at a higher level. What I will show you in this video are just basic setups that are, in my opinion, easy enough to learn for beginners, but are also a strong foundation to build upon later. I highly recommend watching the entire segment, as I will only explain repeating things once. Beginning with Templar, we will first take care of the HOTS, which should always be the main healing source, as I already explained. For that we use Illustrious Healing from the Restoration Staff and Energy Orb from the Undaunted skill line. The orb gives one of the most important synergies on top of being a really good healing ability. And at the third HOT, we use Extended Ritual. Additionally, we take 2 skills for burst healing, the first one being Combat Prayer. Combat Prayer is probably the single most important healing ability in the game, and it is used in almost any build, because it combines a cheap and strong heal with an important buff. Completely relying on Combat Prayer for burst healing is pretty common for experienced healers, and you should absolutely try to mostly use Combat Prayer for burst healing. However, because it is not as easy to use, the builds in this video all have a second, stronger burst heal. A panic button if you want. On Templar, this is Ritual of Rebirth. And that is all healing covered. Apart from that, we use Elemental Blockade from the Destruction Staff, Blockade is very important for healers to trigger many different effects. For the builds in this video, we are using it for proccing our enchantment and Minor Magicka Steel. And for said Minor Magicka Steel, we have Elemental Drain from the Destruction Staff. Minor Magicka Steel is an important effect for the resource management of Magicka damage dealers as well as healers. Additionally, we also take Power of the Light for the resistance debuff and Minor Sorcery from the passives. And our last active skill is Concentrated Focus, simply a very efficient ability for more resources and survivability. The two remaining slots we just fill up with Magelight to passively get more Magicka and Magicka regeneration. Generally, healers want to provide as much support as possible, as already explained, and therefore really get the most out of every single gear and skill slot. However, it doesn't make sense to have support that you don't properly use, so it can be better for beginners to play less support, but then really use that properly. For the ultimates, we use the Warhorn morph, Aggressive Horn, and Reviving Barrier. Aggressive Horn is the standard ultimate for support roles, as it is an extremely strong offensive support ability with basically no alternative. As a defensive alternative, we then have Barrier. For one, it gives us 10% more regeneration via the passives, but it is also usually the best defensive ultimate. The important factor is that Barrier gives a shield, which decreases reaction time and makes otherwise deadly situations survivable. A shield instantly mitigates damage, while healing can only offset damage already inflicted. There would also be no point in wasting an ultimate for healing, since we already heal more than enough with just our normal skills. However, we can not really give significant shields apart from Barrier. To get those two ultimates, you have to play quite a bit of PvP. While you don't have them, you can use Solar Prison on the Templar. And the rotation then looks as follows. We recast Illustrious Healing, Energy Orb, Elemental Blockade, and Power of the Light every 10 seconds. Every second rotation, we renew Extended Ritual, Elemental Drain, and Concentrated Focus as well. In between, we heal primarily with Combat Prayer and occasionally Ritual of Rebirth when it gets really chaotic with high incoming damage. To build upon this basic rotation, you should first of all go for a good Minor Berserk uptime. That means getting your Combat Prayer onto every damage dealer every 8 seconds, or 12 seconds with Joel's guidance, but more on that later. This is the case for every class, by the way. Secondly, you also want to keep up Power of the Light constantly, instead of just recasting it every 10 seconds, which is quite a bit more difficult. Further, you want to at some point replace Magelight with further support or situational skills, which we will go over in the class independent stuff at the end. Apart from that, Templar also has Radiant Aura and Illuminous Shards as alternative support skills. And with Breath of Life, Templar also has a strong single target alternative to Ritual of Rebirth. For the Warden, we will again use Illustrious Healing and Energy Orb. The third hot is Budding Seeds. For our burst healing, we of course also use Combat Prayer, and as a strong alternative, Enchanted Growth. Apart from that, we also take Elemental Blockade and Elemental Drain, and specifically for the Warden, Expensive Frostcloak. For the resistances, Fetter Infection for minor vulnerability, and Blue Badinage for our Magicka management. The ultimates are also Warhorn and Barrier. Until you unlock them, you can use Northern Storm. And the rotation is Illustrious Healing, Energy Orb, Budding Seeds, Elemental Blockade, and Fetter Infection every 10 seconds, Elemental Drain every second rotation, and Frostcloak, Blue Betty, and Enchanted Growth every third rotation. In between, we heal with Combat Prayer and Enchanted Growth in emergencies. This actually already covers Warden's entire support, and that is why I recommend it so much. Otherwise, Warden has lots of very situational skills, such as Shimmering Shield or Deceptive Predator. On the Sorcerer, we once again use Illustrious Healing and Energy Orb, and as the third hot, Power Surge. For burst healing, we have Combat Prayer and Twilight Matriarch. The Twilight Matriarch is a pet that needs to be on both bars, and the active part, as long as she is summoned, is a pretty powerful heal. Otherwise, we use Elemental Blockade and Elemental Drain as we do on every class, and specifically with the Sorcerer, we also use Dark Conversion. Sorcerer has no longer lasting ability for passive sustain like most classes, but needs to use Dark Conversion instead. It requires more attention, but in return gives also more control of our resources. And the last skill slot we simply fill up with Magelight. As ultimates, we use Barrier and Warhorn. If you don't have them, you can use Greater Storm Atronach. The rotation is Illustrious Healing, Energy Orb, and Elemental Blockade every 10 seconds, every second rotation, Elemental Drain, and every third rotation, Power Surge, and Dark Conversion for the Minor Prophecy. Otherwise, we heal with Combat Prayer and Twilight Matriarch, and use Dark Conversion should we run low on Magicka. In terms of additional support, Sorcerer only offers Lightning Splash for a synergy. But what makes Sorcerer interesting is more the solid foundation for playing non-class specific support, or fulfilling roles that require additional damage, high mobility, or defenses. On the Necromancer, we once again use Illustrious Healing and Energy Orb as the HOTS. Additionally, we use Spirit Guardian, which also functions sort of as a HOT, and most importantly, passively gives us regeneration. For burst healing, we have Combat Prayer and Enduring Undeath, which can also be a HOT if we place it on a corpse. You might already have noticed, Necromancer works quite a bit differently, and exactly that is why I don't recommend it for beginners. Apart from that though, we have Elemental Blockade and Elemental Drain on the Necromancer as well, and additionally Agony Totem and Necrotic Potency to generate ultimate between or even during fights if we have nothing else to do. And the last slot we fill up with Magelight again. For the ultimate, we take Glacial Colossus, a very strong offensive support ability. This makes Necromancer the only healer class that is mostly played without Warren. But as our second ultimate, we will still use Barrier. For the rotation, we recast Illustrious Healing, Energy Orb, Elemental Blockade and Agony Totem every 10 seconds, and every second rotation also Elemental Drain and Spirit Guardian. In between we heal with Combat Prayer and situationally Enduring Undeath, and generate ultimate with Necrotic Potency. To build upon this basic setup, Necromancer offers quite a few options. Empowering Grasp is very popular with well-optimized groups, as Empower is a very strong damage buff that is otherwise hard to come by. Unnerving Boneyard is interesting as well for the synergy and resistance debuff. But also different abilities that create corpses can be good to generate more ultimate, damage or healing. Necromancer also has an ultimate that resurrects players, and Rend the Flesh would be the single target alternative to Enduring Undeath. For the Nightblades as HOTS we use Illustrious Healing, Energy Orb and Refreshing Path. As burst healing we have Combat Prayer and Healthy Offering. Apart from that we take Elemental Blockade, Elemental Drain and Siphoning attacks. The remaining bar space we fill up with Magelight, and as ultimates we use Aggressive Horn and Reviving Barrier. Until you have those, you can do with Bolstering Darkness. The resulting rotation is Illustrious Healing, Energy Orb, Elemental Blockade and Refreshing Path every 10 seconds, and Elemental Drain and Siphoning attacks every second round. In the remaining time, we heal with Combat Prayer and Healthy Offering. At this point, I would like to list further support options, but there just are none. Nightblade offers abilities to combine existing healing and support with damage, but that is it. So the last class is Dragon Knight. As HOTS, we use Illustrious Healing, Energy Orb and Cauterize. For burst healing, we have Combat Prayer and Obsidian Shard. Otherwise, we have Elemental Blockade, Elemental Drain, Engulfing Flames and Igneous Weapons. For our ultimates, we use Aggressive Horn and Reviving Barrier. To start out, you can use Standard of Might. The rotation is every 10 seconds, Illustrious Healing, Energy Orb, Elemental Blockade and Engulfing Flames. Every second rotation, we also recast Elemental Drain and Cauterize. And Igneous Weapons lasts so long that it makes more sense to just recast it on a timer. Otherwise, we primarily heal with Combat Prayer and Obsidian Shard for emergencies. As additional support, Dragon Knight offers Stone Giant. It also has a more standard AoE HOT, Cinderstorm, but the radius is just so tiny that I can only recommend it in really static fights. Otherwise worth mentioning is that Dragon Knight can use Fragmented Shield to buff itself Major Mending, which is the playstyle I would recommend for trial content. Now that we covered all classes, we take a look at other class-independent options. Beginning with the Restoration staff, we have another really good HOT with Radiating Regeneration. I didn't include it in the builds as I think it is easier for beginners to play with just normal ground-based HOTs, but you can absolutely use Radiating Regeneration in addition or as a replacement, particularly in chaotic situations. The Restoration staff also gives us access to a shield with Healing Ward. I generally don't recommend using it as a burst heal replacement, but where this ability becomes interesting are mechanics with healing reduction, as shields are not affected by that. And lastly, Restoration Staff offers an alternative to Elemental Drain in the form of Siphon Spirit. The Destruction Staff gives us another interesting skill as well, and that is Crushing Shock. Sometimes the task of interrupting falls on the healer, and Crushing Shock allows us to do so at range. Multiple important skills can also be found in the Undaunted skill line. Overflowing Altar should be present in every trial group. Minor Life Steal gives the entire group some additional healing, and the synergy is very useful for tanks. And Bone Surge is another pretty decent shield ability. It is used similar to Healing Ward, just in different situations. And in the Alliance War support skill line, we have Efficient Purge. There are only a handful of fights where we need to remove negative effects, but in those, Efficient Purge is crucial. And the last one is Mythic Guard, which healers can use in situations where tanks take so much damage that it is otherwise impossible to keep them alive. Now that we're done with the abilities, we move on to the passives. You basically want all passives from your 3 class lines and 2 weapons, so restoration and destruction stuff. Since many passives are linked to specific skills, you can drop some of them if you really need the points. It is pretty self-explanatory. Apart from that, you should have everything from light armor and maybe also medium and heavy armor, depending on your gear. When you use major skills, you definitely want Magicka Controller and maybe also Major Damped, Everlasting Magic and Might of the Guild. From Undaunted, you want both passives, and from the Alliance War support skill line, Magicka Aid. From crafting, medicinal use from alchemy is very important, and gourmand and connoisseur from provisioning are also pretty useful. Generally, you want all professions at least once to be able to properly upgrade your gear, and alchemy and provisioning on every character. Let's talk about the champion point system now. After reaching level 50, you gain champion points for further experience as an account-wide level. This system goes to 3,600 points, but the vertical progression ends somewhere around 1,400 points. Gear also scales with your champion level, with 160 being the highest item level. This means that farming and upgrading gear starts being worthwhile after 160 CP, as you can use those items forever. Further, you can spend your champion points on each character to unlock passive bonuses. Next we will go over the champion point distribution for healers. The champion point system is split up into 3 constellations, green, blue and red. Green isn't relevant for this video, blue is offense and defense, and red is resources and also defense. The nodes are split up into 2 types, slottables, which you can only use 4 at a time, and passive ones, which aren't limited. Beginning with the blue constellation, for the 4 slottables, on a normal healing build, I would basically always recommend Enlivening Overflow, Hope Infusion, Soothing Tide and Swift Renewal. For the unlocking order, I recommend Eldritch Insight, Blessed, Enlivening Overflow, Hope Infusion, Soothing Tide, Swift Renewal, Quick Recovery, Preparation, Elemental Aegis, Hardy, Precision, Piercing, Flawless Ritual, War Mage and lastly Tireless Discipline. You can also optimize it a little bit more by only putting the minimal amount of points in the first 2 nodes in order to unlock the stronger slotted nodes quicker. In the red constellation, you should use Boundless Vitality, Rejuvenation and Ironclad as slottables, and for the 4th one I would either recommend Slippery or Expert Evasion. The unlocking order is then Boundless Vitality, Rejuvenation, Ironclad, Tumbling, Mystic Tenacity, Hero's Vigor, Defiance, Slippery or Expert Evasion, Tireless Guardian, Fortification, Hasty, Nimble Protector, Sprinter, Savage Defense, Piercing Gaze, Tempered Soul, and lastly Bashing Brutality. Okay, moving on to gear. Healing builds are more than anything defined by the 5-piece sets. Having a large arsenal of support sets available and choosing the right ones for the group or situation at hand is part of what makes a good healer. In consequence, builds vary greatly, and the ability to properly adjust your own build becomes important as well. Hence why I will not only show you what, in my opinion, the best gear for beginners is, but also how you can adjust it to your needs and what other support sets are worth getting. So you have a good foundation to carry on independently. Similar to these skills, gear is also largely class independent, and there are only very few specific setups that aren't. The build I want to showcase in this video is Spell Power Cure and Jorbolt's Guidance. Spell Power Cure is probably the overall strongest support set at the moment. Major Courage is a very important buff for every group and Spell Power Cure is its best source. Additionally, the set is also very easy to use. It is essentially completely passive. It is also relatively easy to come by. Spell Power Cure drops in White Gold Tower. For the second 5-piece set, I've chosen Jorbolt's Guidance. Jorbolt's Guidance increases the duration of all major and minor buffs, which makes it a perfect beginner set, since it compensates bad buff up times and makes it generally easier to support. On the other hand, it is also a set that you can keep long term, as it sees use all the way to high-end groups, where it is usually played in combination with Roaring Opportunist. Joel's guidance is obtained from Scalecaller Peak. For the remaining gear slots, there are multiple different combinations of 2-piece sets, depending on what 5-piece sets are used. The simplest option is to wear 2 pieces of willpower. Better options are, however, arena weapons, monster sets, or a combination of both. Spellpower Cure and Joel's Guidance are both sets that should be active on both bars, so we could only use either a monster set or 2 arena weapons. But I will go over those options in more detail later. For now, we move on to traits and enchantments. For the armor, you basically always want Divine. You can alternatively go with Infused on the big pieces, so head, chest and legs, but I wouldn't recommend it. You can also use health, but I would recommend using attributes points to adjust the health pool instead, as it is more flexible. On that note, you currently want at least 20,000 health, preferably 25,000, and as a beginner you can even go as high as 30,000 if it helps you not die, since you will take more damage than players with higher CP levels and most likely also make more mistakes. On the jewelry, we want Arcane or Infused as the trait. I would recommend Arcane though, as it is the default trait of light armor, so you don't need to change anything. And for the enchantment, we use either spell damage or magical regeneration, depending on what stat we need. For this build, we go with 3 times spell damage. But ultimately, you should test out how much regeneration you need for yourself, as it varies greatly between builds and also individual players. With good resource management, it is possible to play with very minimal regeneration, but for beginners it is easier to play with a bit more. As a rough number, I would recommend about 1800 magical regeneration. For the weapons, we have quite a few options. On the restoration staff, there are basically 3 good options: powered for more healing, charged for more support, and precise for more damage. For this build, we use charged. On the destruction staff, it's simple. We always use infused, as it is the only trait that still functions while the weapon isn't active. For enchantments, we also have multiple options. For support, we can use shock, crusher or weakening, but we can also use magicka absorption or berserker. Fundamentally, we always want to use 2 different weapon enchantments and have the stronger one on the destruction staff, so it gets boosted by infused and constantly reapplied with the blockade. For this build, we have berserker on the healing staff and shock on the destruction staff. For the destruction staff, we use a lightning one. The only exception is Warden, for which we use a powered restoration staff with berserker and a infused ice staff with crusher. The lightning staff with shock enchant is used to apply off balance and minor vulnerability via the status effect. Warden, however, already has minor vulnerability, the way more important effect, with Fetter Infection. You might have noticed that I haven't really talked about the offensive stats: magicka, spell power, crit and so on. An optimal distribution can be calculated, but this would be far too complex for this video, and is actually not even that relevant for healers. We can't completely control our stats anyway, as we simply have to accept whatever the support sets give us. The 5-piece bonuses is what really matters. For the most part, understanding that more is better is actually enough. Anyways, let's continue with the Munda Stones. For pure healing output, Ritual is usually the best choice. For damage, or a mix of healing and damage, Thief should come out on top for the normal healing builds. Atronach can also be worthwhile if you need more sustain. For this build, we go with Ritual. For the attribute points, we want as much in magicka as possible, so ideally 64. It depends on how much health we otherwise have though, since attribute points are also the easiest way to adjust it. For this build, I decided on 44 in magicka and 20 in health for the 300 champion points I did my testing with. Another really good tool for adjusting stats is buff food. Whenever you participate in group activities, you should be using buff food. Interesting for healers are health, magicka and magicka regeneration, which are available in multiple different configurations. For this build, we use Witchmother's Potent Brew. The second consumable item are of course potions. With the alchemy passives, it is possible to keep up many potion effects permanently, so they are treated like a normal build component. Healers usually use either spell power or heroism potions. Those are however expensive, for beginners most likely far too expensive. Hence why I would recommend using Essence of Magicka, the potions you can get from bosses, chests and so on instead. When talking about money, we also need to talk about gear upgrades. Making an entire build golden costs a lot, somewhere between 2 and 3 million gold. However, the cost effectiveness ratio is far from linear. Weapons and glyphs are by far the most important and cost effective. The original enchantments the gear drops with are even upgraded automatically with the gear. Jewelry, on the other hand, is ridiculously expensive and does almost nothing. So be smart about what you upgrade. Generally, it is also important to have all professions leveled to decrease the upgrade costs in the passives. Additionally, you should be doing the daily crafting writs and deconstructing higher quality gear instead of selling it in order to get more upgrading materials. In the next section, we will take a look at all the currently relevant healer sets, so you have an overview of what you can work towards. Starting out with resource support, we have quite a few options. First of all, Worm's Raiment and Hircine's Veneer, which are basically the same set, just one for Magicka and the other for Stamina. Both sets are pretty strong and completely passive, but that also means they need to be double barred. Worm comes from Waltz of Madness and Hircine's from Selene's Web. For Magicka, there's also Hollowing Thirst, which is similarly strong, however can be played on one bar and also multiple times in a group. Hollowfang drops from Moongrave Fane. The potentially strongest option at the moment is Stonetalker's Oath from Rockgrove. The set is, however, more situational and complex. It is perfect for backbar only. Two additional options are also Eye of Navintas from Sunspire and Kain's Wind from Kain's Aegis. Both options are not that efficient, but can be used in mixed groups in particular. Kain's Wind can be used on one bar, Navintas cannot. Moving on to the offensive support sets. First of all, we have Olorim. Olorim is basically a worse version of Spellpower Cure in most scenarios. The only real benefit is that it can be played on one bar. But viewed on its own, Olorim is still one of the best support sets, and worth mentioning. Olorim drops in Cloud Rest. For the very important Major Slayer buff, we have two options. Firstly, Master Architect, which is barely used by normal healers. It comes from Halls of Fabrication. Secondly, however, we have Roaring Opportunist from Kain's Aegis, and that is one of the most popular healing sets at the moment, and especially in combination with Joel's Guidance, extremely potent. Both can be used on one bar. Further, we have Saxhleel Champion from Rockgrove, a very strong set option, particularly for builds that don't want to use Warhorn. It can be used on one bar. Powerful Assault is another good set I can also recommend for beginners, since it is easy to use and also easy to come by. Powerful Assault drops from Cyrodiil and is, in contrast to all the dungeon and raid sets, tradable. And for the last three offensive options, we have Martial Knowledge, Sense Redress and Elemental Catalyst. All three are more complex sets that are mostly used for high-level optimization. Martial Knowledge drops in Cragglorn, Sen in Layer of Marsalok, and Catalyst in Stone Garden. Continuing with the defensive sets, there isn't that much to talk about. We have a lot of defensive sets, but defensive support just is pretty weak overall. Firstly, we have Inventor's Guard and Vrol's Command as the defensive counterparts to the Major Slayer sets. Inventor's Guard comes from Halls of Fabrication and Vrol's Command from Kain's Aegis. Further, we got Mending from Etherian Archive. The set is also somewhere around 10% damage reduction usually, and can be used on one bar. It has to be the primary one though. Gossamer from Cradle of Shadows can be a really strong defensive option, is however extremely situational and needs to be active on both bars. And the last set worth mentioning is, in my opinion, Combat Physician. It is a lot less situational than most of the other options, but also not very strong. And it should be played on both bars. Combat Physician drops in Wayrest Sewers. Now to the monster sets and arena weapons. For the monster sets, we have two resource support options, Symphony of Blades from Depth of Malatar and Sentinel of Rekugams from Darkshade Caverns 2. Symphony is clearly the go-to option, and Rekugams is then used if additional resource support is needed. For the offensive support, we have one monster set available, and that is Enkratis Behemoth from Blackdrake Villa. Since there are only 3 support options, in contrast to the massive amount of 5-piece sets, it can sometimes make sense to use a healing set. For that, the main 2 options are Nightflame from Elden Hollow 2 and Earthgore from Bloodroot Forge. With the arena weapons, we have two support options for the healing staff. Firstly, the Master Restoration staff from Dragonstar Arena, and secondly, the Veteran Restoration staff from Veteran Hollows. Generally, the Master staff is used, and the Veteran staff can be a situationally stronger choice. But depending on the build, you can also have other restoration or destruction staff options, and almost all arena weapons can be useful, depending on which of the linked abilities you need in your build. For destruction staff, the go-to option is usually the Maelstrom staff, as it gives the highest damage increase. And we end the section with the mythic items. There's currently only one mythic that is really relevant for healers. That is Pearls of Elnofey, and it can be incredibly strong if used correctly. To wrap up the subject of builds, we need to quickly talk about the optimization and coordinated groups. For 4-player groups, but even more so 12-player groups, it is important for support optimization to avoid unnecessary overlap. This means that if one player alone can keep up an effect, nobody else should be using it. But instead use the free set or skill slot for additional support. If an effect can, however, not be held up sufficiently by a single player, or can be stacked, it can make sense for multiple players to use it. As examples, Minor Magicka Seal should only be used by one player. Combat Prayer can potentially be provided by a single player, but should usually be played by both healers. Warhorn needs to be used by multiple support players, as it cannot be kept up permanently by a single one. Therefore, it is really important for planning more difficult activities to coordinate yourself with the other support players and to have alternative setups ready. Also, keep in mind that the tasks should be fairly and logically distributed. The goal is forming the most efficient group possible and not making it easy for yourself. So, we are nearing the end of this video. For the last topic, we will go over the game settings, and I will show you what you can change to improve your performance as a healer. The first thing I absolutely recommend is setting Quick Cast Ground abilities in the Gameplay tab to on. With that, you don't need to additionally click to confirm the placement of your ground abilities, making rotation faster and smoother, shortening reaction times and improving your weaving. The second tip includes two different settings in the Camera tab, Field of View and Vertical Offset. By increasing your field of view and moving your camera up, you can increase your situational awareness and make the positioning of your character as well as your AoE abilities easier. As tip number 3, I would recommend turning on names and health bars in the nameplate section for group members. This makes it easier to find players and quickly react to incoming damage. For more clarity, I would also recommend reducing the names and health bars for other things to a minimum. In the Combat tab, we have multiple interesting options. I would recommend turning on ability bar timers and ability bar back row. This gives you timers for all abilities, which tremendously help with your rotation and uptime. I would also recommend turning on numbers and percent for resources and ultimate numbers. Turning on combat text for outgoing healing and damage can also be very helpful. Not that the actual numbers really matter, but it gives you hit feedback. Think of it like hit markers in shooters. And the last setting I recommend is generally turning on buffs and debuffs. This allows you to see the duration of your effects on your targets and yourself, and can also help with seeing mechanics that give you specific debuffs. On PC, you can alternatively use add-ons for many of those functions. But the topic of add-ons goes too far for this video. If you're interested in my add-on configuration, a video is linked in the description. And that is it for this guide. I hope I was able to help you with this video. Of course, everyone learning this game has a different level of understanding, and it is just impossible to explain every little detail in one video. So, if you have any further questions, please ask them in the comments and I will try my best to help you. Apart from that, you can also find links to all resources I use in the video description. Those also include some very good sources of further information. Anyways, thanks for